The Sengoku era, a time of warring states among the Japanese islands, starting as a result of the Onin War, where the shogunate would collapse amidst governing upheaval, and once that power vacuum had been opened up, there was no end to the fighting in sight. For nearly 2 centuries, Japan would find itself in constant war among those trying to claim the capital, as well as those just trying to stay alive in their respective regions. Oda Nobunaga would later lead a war unification, dying shortly before realizing Japanese unification. And yet, despite the setback, a successor would be chosen and Japan would go on to unite under one island and one system. This government would establish Japan as a sovereign nation, as well as set the stage for the warrior culture and isolationism seen later down the line. But what if Japan never became whole? How would this happen? Well, in this timeline, we would see Oda be assassinated just as he was in our timeline. But in this world, Akechi Mitsude, Oda's killer, would never die. Instead, he would become the self-proclaimed shogun during the confusion of the era, and his rule would last far longer than a month. The battle which would see his complete fall from power would play out slightly different in this timeline, as in our timeline, Mitsude would have an opportunity to destroy the oncoming loyalists of Oda before they could even confront his forces, but he decided not to do it. He did this as he wanted to destroy the army himself rather than dispatch one, which doing so allowed them to get a way better position and completely destroy his forces. So in this timeline, let's say he listened to his advisors and dispatched a nearby army rather than confront them himself. With the loyalists dead, there was no other successor to the Oda clan other than Mitsude, which would allow him to establish his rule. During those days of destroying loyalists, the neighboring clans would have turned against this traitor, and parts of Mitsude's shogunate would break away in yet another succession crisis. Many other Oda loyalists would attempt to fight for their master, while others would take the opportunity to better their influence in Mitsude's territory. The Mitsuhide shogunate would survive this crisis, albeit narrowly, but it would be way too wounded to do any type of unification war anytime soon. The eastern Mori clans would take the opportunity to set their eyes on the southeastern islands, just as they did in our timeline, and would begin skirmishes along the Edo capital region, bringing much more years of warring. Northern clans would stay separated with no clear force strong enough to unite the region, but clans in the region would still unite in a military force to keep out the Mitsude faction, as well as any other warring factions in the region. This would separate the island into the South Mori Kingdom, Central Mitsude Shogunate, and the Northern Confederation of Clans. Of course, as these kingdoms established each other, the situation would dissolve into a stalemate, as the older leaders would die off over time. The Mori Kingdom would become a merchant society, with the Dutch influence becoming more prevalent during the 17th century. Meanwhile, the Central Shogunate would be the same isolationist warrior society that Japan was in our timeline. Things would progress this way until the age of imperialism. The dawn of the 19th century would bring spheres of influence from the Dutch, Portuguese, British, and much more. The Mori Kingdom would be plagued with European influence, and the same unequal treaties that China faced would befall them as well. The British could go as far as to claim Nagasaki as a Hong Kong-type trading city, and maybe even the Dutch and Portuguese and French even claim their own cities. The weakness of the South would intrigue the Central Shogunate, but it would be far too late as the Americans arrived. With the Central Japanese being a lot more aggressive and more xenophobic due to the fall of the South, the arrival of the bargaining Americans would be met with the most hostility and might even verge on war. And upon a demonstration of American naval prowess, the Shogunate would have to surrender to their demands. This would only be met with as a temporary solution, as Commodore Matthew Perry would be ambushed upon boarding the island. The death of Commodore Perry would lead to a mass-scale invasion of the shogunate, where they wouldn't really last a chance as they hadn't really industrialized, meaning they would most likely become imperialized, similar to the Philippines, becoming an American puppet, but most importantly, an American naval base. The Northern Confederation of Clans would meet the wrath of the approaching Russians, with the 2 northern islands being entirely seized. Meanwhile, any clan between the American and Russian territories would find themselves uniting to the First Japanese Republic that would protect itself from its neighboring imperialists. Without any invasion of Korea or a Russo-Japanese war, it's most likely that China actually does a lot better in this timeline, as it would never have to fight against the Japanese and be humiliated even more. Plus, Japan might even take away some of the pressure it was facing. Meanwhile, in Korea, we could see them grow into a military-like society built on xenophobia as well, and maybe even trying to fight a war of independence from the Russians, who would be encroaching way too much on their sovereignty. Maybe even seizing Port Arthur and the peninsula for themselves from the Chinese in this timeline. By the time the World War kicks off, the world would have changed massively. The United States has embraced imperialism far more. Russian prestige is unquestioned. The Qing Empire is being held together by several foreign powers, whose spheres of influences cover whole chunks of the nation. The war plays out mostly the same, with only slightly difference being that the Germans focus more on the Russians, destabilizing them early on while making little gains in Belgium. German territory in China would instead be seized by rebel groups who were supported by the Allies, who were promised independence for their aid. We could see the Qing and the Mori Kingdom join on the side of the Entente, but this is more or less a theatrical action, as no real troops would be sent. Just like in our timeline, most support from Asia would come industrially in the forms of sent workforces and manufactured weaponry. Locals in China and Japan would begin to protest the war heavily, just as the Russians' front collapsed and the United States got involved. The end of the war would play out just like how it did in our timeline, revolution in Russia and the fall of the German Empire all happening just how it did in our timeline. But the big difference would be that across China we would see an Asian Spring where several different nationalists in China would rise up against the Qing Empire and try and overthrow the government, as well as the several spheres of influence cities. Along with that, a mass uprising of Japanese socialists in the Mori Kingdom would begin, overthrowing the king and expelling all the foreigners, closing off the country completely. The aforementioned Japanese Republic would take the opportunity of the Russian Civil War to take the northern islands from them, as well as occupy Vladivostok with joint Korean assistance, and begin to set its eyes on the reclamation of the rest of the island, hoping to stomp out the communists and the shogunate imperialists. After a militarist coup in Korea, the Seoul Accords would be set up, a treaty organization between Japan and Korea in order to make sure that no foreigners could ever influence their politics and or exploit their resources again. A puppet government of the Japanese and Koreans would be set up in Beijing, led by Sun Yat-sen, who believed in the Republican ideals, but was forced to deal with the massive warlord problem following the collapse of the Qing Empire. Following the successful Asian Spring and the domination of Eastern Russia, the Japanese Republic would now set its eyes on the South, planning to destroy the Socialist Union and eradicate the American puppet.